This is episode 464 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, well, I was very lucky to be traveling recently, not because New Mexico's not lovely, but because I was in Jackson, Wyoming with anti-tax advocates and all-around good guy Grover Norquist and a bunch of other folks from the broadly center-right movement across the country, talking about ways that we can reform government, limit the size of government, and strategize about carrying those efforts out. Of course, few states have as many woes in terms of the political situation as New Mexico does, but it was a great opportunity to get together with some folks. And you ever been to Jackson Hole, Jackson, Wyoming?
No, I have not, but I've heard good things, and Wyoming is home to many little, medium, and very large fishies, so I'd love to get up there sometime. So,
yeah, it was very cold, very, very cold considering the weather we had in Albuquerque during that time. A lot of snow, some moose were sighted, bighorn sheep and other various wildlife. It's nice they allow us to get out and get beyond the area where we were particularly staying, but just an incredible area. And the consensus is that the election was, as I've kind of seen it from New Mexico, that people were often voting just on their kind of anti-Trump sentiment, voting against the election denial, whether that's a viable issue or not. People on the moderates and Democratic side, and I think that's the critical thing, is no matter what you feel about the last few elections, the reality is that those center and swing voters are not buying it, and they're actively organized against President Trump, former President Trump, as well as the abortion issue played a significant role in the last election. So, folks from Georgia discussing the Herschel Walker campaign and how that race went down. Of course, Walker lost that race, and now the Democrats, well, they kind of had the majority and then lost it with Kyrsten Sinema. But anyway, all kinds of strategizing about ways to bring limited government and free market principles to New Mexico, and a great setting. I can see why those folks at the Federal Reserve Bank have their big annual shindig at Jackson Hole. Maybe not partying with the central bankers. Maybe that's not too exciting, but the location can't be beat. It's very nice.
Yeah, it's the Davos of the United States, right? So,
yeah, in many ways, and no sightings of any Cheney or kin of Cheney. So there was that as well, because I believe Dick Cheney and probably his daughter have places up there or something. It's very nice area. So talking more into the policies, of course, this is in many ways the calm before the storm, or the somewhat calm before the real calm, and then the storm hits in early January. But a lot of interesting kind of articles and reports coming out. This is when the LFC, Legislative Finance Committee, the internal think tank of the legislature, tends to kind of highlight some of the things that they want to put on the agenda. Like all think tanks and all policy organizations outside of government, the LFC has its own priorities. They're not immune from that, even though they serve at the pleasure of the legislature. They issued a report saying that New Mexicans' access to the state's Medicaid program is hampered by a shortage of providers, low provider pay rates, and outdated contact information that frustrates those seeking care. There's barriers for consumers, and
And Paul, I will say that maybe not on the outdated list, but the first two, I think that applies to all New Mexicans. It is tough to get scheduled with a healthcare provider in many specialties here in New Mexico. So I think this extends way beyond Medicaid, but I'm sure, Medicaid is the lowest pay. I'm sure if you have a choice between a privately insured patient and a Medicaid, if you're in the healthcare field, you definitely want that private insured patient.
yeah, and we've talked about the doctor shortage. We've studied the doctor shortage. We're going to have our own report come out at the beginning of 2023 prior to the session kicking off. First and foremost, this study found that 47% of New Mexicans are on Medicaid. That is a mind-blowingly large number, and a deeply frustrating one. And that's right there, probably the single most important factor in creating this problem. I would say it's a combination of the high numbers and the low reimbursement rates for Medicaid. And that's something we discussed on a recent interview with Sandy Whistler and another physician talking about the issue of Medicaid reimbursements. And that's a program that's a joint federal state program, expansion under Obama and Obamacare. So we've, to the extent that Obamacare insured, and I use that term in quotes because welfare is not an insurance program, Medicaid is not an insurance program. We just extended health quote coverage to more and more people. I'm using all these scare quotes because this article gets to the heart of the matter, which is that offering somebody a government benefit program and saying you're covered now is not the same as actually getting health coverage or health access to those people. You need more doctors to serve more people, but you're not going to get more doctors interested in covering more Medicaid patients when the reimbursement rates are that low. And there may not be a simple approach, because if you have plenty of people that you're seeing, patients who are paying their insurance rate, or even Medicare, Medicare being for the elderly, Medicaid being for the poor, then you are unlikely to take on those new patients. Remember, we are in a doctor shortage right now. And just one of the things that was at the end of this article, the state's Human Services Department administers the Medicaid program, which is funded with about $8.8 billion with a B, state and federal funds every year. Now that's kind of a housekeeping issue because that's overwhelmingly federal dollars.
Yeah, big time. And
Obamacare was 100%. Now I think it's down to 90%. Right. The feds are matching, if you will. We, being a poor state, we get an overwhelming match under existing Medicaid. Then Obamacare came along and was even more generous as their means of buying off more states to cover it. But that people may think, well, what the heck, 8.8 billion? Well, our general fund budget previously last year, soon to be much higher, I'm sure, right, but the current that we're living under is $8.4 billion. Well, that's because the general fund budget doesn't include Medicaid and a lot of other spending. The real budget with it, all that included, is on the order of $22 billion. So massive spending. And there's two different approaches. And Wally, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But one is you got to get people off Medicaid. You've got to limit their ability to access this free money to them, and push them back into the workforce. So we solve the workforce participation rate and some of the issues with access. Or you could simply make Medicaid more generous in its payments. Now, that may or may not solve the problem, But you could do a combination of both, and as long as you're serious about starting to move people away from being on Medicaid, you can do the more generous payments and I think move the needle on both sides a little bit. But yeah, this is a serious component of our healthcare, medical provider crisis.
Yeah, and one of the things that New Mexico faces risk is being a ward of the federal government, like we are in many respects, is that if and when the feds stop printing money with reckless abandon, we could be, much more exposed to big fiscal problems. So, to the point about making it better for the doctors and getting people off, I really agree. I am not an expert in this, but as I've talked to people who actually are on Medicaid and have other entitlement programs, other government benefit programs, the talk of these donut holes come up quite frequently, where it's like, oh, I don't want to make more money, or I don't want to work on the clock. Some of them work, under the table, because I will lose these benefits. And I think that that's something that our systems in the United States have always tended to fall a little short on. Is you don't necessarily get what you want, you get what you incentivize. And I think there are some really weird incentives out there right now. And again, but the point is that, will New Mexico be better off if 47% of Medicaid goes to 57 and 67? And it's like, no, that's kind of an indication of a failed state, not a failed nation. There's plenty of those around, but at some point you will not be able to dig out of the hole. And even though the percentage is pretty small, if the feds ever make the states pay even a little bit more, that could be the entire quote unquote new money that we ever have for as far as the eye can see. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons that are important to really take a good hard look at that number and what can we do to manage it downward, as opposed to say, okay, this is just the way it's going to be, which is kind of the political status quo here in New Mexico right now, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and kind of what we're hinting at almost without coming out and saying is that money only gets you so far. You know,
Of government money only, it does, Paul.
right.
Yeah, because, as much as these billions of dollars that the state has, again, you give that all back to the people. You're talking $1, $2, $3,000 per person, which, believe me, there's almost no one in New Mexico who wouldn't notice an additional couple $1,000s in the bank. But if that doesn't change the direction, and the direction is from, higher labor participation rate, better educated workforce, more business activity outside of the oil and gas industry, we are going to continue to face problems for a long time to come.
Yeah, and the tendency is for more of that money to be used to expand government programs, and when you have those dollars, I mean, cutting government is tough enough when you don't have the money.
Right.
When you do have the money, it is doubly difficult. But there's absolutely no question that what needs to happen is that people need to be moved on the margins. I'm not saying nobody on Medicaid deserves it or needs it, but 47% of your population cannot be in need of government Medicaid assistance. There needs to be limits to that, reductions of that, and as much as it may make political sense to increase, just increase Medicaid payments, I don't even know if that moves the needle in terms of the number of doctors serving these patients, because Medicaid pays so much lower than other forms of insurance or other payment mechanisms they have access to. What really needs to happen is for the demand side, the number of people on Medicaid to drop, and that system needs to right itself or be righted. But I would be stunned if we saw that kind of initiative out of Santa Fe this session, given where we are. So, I'm not going to go down the path, if you will, of saying that our revenue picture has, is a problematic one, if you will. But there are issues and challenges and problems with it that certainly don't seem likely to be solved and addressed in this particular round of the legislature. So
Yeah, and the way I view it is the amount of money has overcome the imagination of the legislators and the governor in terms of what can be done or what could be done or what should be done, and they've just thrown their arms up. I have some ideas, and I think there's some data points later in your in the outline of the show today that I do have some ideas about what they could do. So,
well, your point, and that point is very well taken, and it's actually kind of the next discussion item because since we talked, we discussed the size and scope of the budget surplus, $3.6 billion, 43% of the general fund budget. Reports are that Governor Lujan Grisham has proposed or will propose legislation to give individual taxpayers $750 rebates, married filing jointly, $1,500 rebates. And, I have written and will be seeing versions of my opinion piece on this topic coming out. We know Mark Ronchetti had a rebate plan, which is ironic because the governor criticized him on that. And for whatever you think of the governor's plan or previous rebate plans, we at the Rio Grande Foundation are A, more than happy to have money back in our pockets, but B, of the strong opinion based on years of policy experience that rebates are not what New Mexico needs necessarily. We need fundamental reforms. Now, Medicaid itself, we kind of discussed that. That's a separate issue. What we need are economic reforms like gross receipts tax and personal income tax reform and cuts that would then make our state more economically diversified. But we'll talk about that again in a minute or so. But these rebates are estimated to quote unquote cost $1 billion, which seems like a lot of money. $1 billion, yes. That's a lot of money, except for the fact that that is only between a quarter and a third of the entire surplus that's available in this particular year. So it's a lot of money. Rebates, not exactly the prescription for what ails New Mexico. I mean, if this state was running on all cylinders, if we were, a bastion of economic growth in the American Southwest where people are flocking to the state and, we had low, reasonable taxes that make our state attractive to large numbers of businesses and we're diversifying, great, by all means, rebate some of that money. But this needs to be a tax reform conversation in this legislative session, not we're just going to rebate, punt on the conversation again.
Yes, absolutely. And, again, not to jump ahead, but a lot of these issues definitely overlap. The quote unquote over reliance on the oil and gas industry and what that would mean in the future. A lot of the things that have been proposed to avoid that over reliance tend to just keep the same systems in place and make them worse, not better. And so, we're beyond kind of having failed policy and keep doing the same thing. We're doubling down and maybe even going to make it worse. And then we might wonder here a few years what could happen. So you give me the hand signal. I've got the plan, Paul. You tell me the number. But, there's things we could do. I think as unsexy as it is, and let me just say, I know it's unsexy, reforming the gross receipts tax, we've got the money to do it now. Take $1 billion of that and say, hey, we're going to take gross receipts tax on business services inputs and small businesses and beyond, and we've got the money to cover that, and then we'll put that in a fund for 5 years so that the deficit hawks or the fiscal hawks in Santa Fe, or more importantly, a lot of the progressives like, oh no, this could never work, this will never work. They can sleep well at night, and maybe we, at the end of that 5-year period, would have an opportunity to have a more robust private economy outside of the oil and gas. So yeah, giving them back, it's better than spending it, particularly in a ongoing program that'll have to be funded in future years. But man, we can do some things. And Paul, the way to avoid, the worst way to get off of oil and gas percentage is shrink oil and gas. Just say, oh, we need to get rid of oil and gas. That's cutting off your nose to spite your face. That's just not a good plan, particularly for a commodity that will be here and be important to the economic and frankly existential. I've used that word. That's the first time I've ever used that word. The existence of the United States. Hey, we're going to need oil and gas for hundreds of years. No matter how much wind and solar and how much nuclear, oil and gas is really important. And guess what? We produce it here in New Mexico as cleanly and as efficiently as anybody, and we get the benefits right here. And we're not subject to the whims of the Middle East and other kind of volatile parts of the world. And so let's keep that going, but let's try to build an economy with the basics. And,
Well, just to be clear, I don't think there's going to be a concerted attack on the oil and gas industry in this session. The state just doesn't have the levers and power to really go after the industry. I've come to that conclusion from talking to a lot of industry experts.
Well, and the feds have done a good job at nibbling at them on the margins. And guess what? As I said before, I was one of the few that was kind of a minority opinion that the feds not doing new leases on BLM land is a big yawner in the short term. In long term, it'll have some impact.
Right.
But the bottom line is the people operating in the Permian Basin have the technology, and they know what they're doing, and they can produce under even more regulation than there is now. Now it'll get to a point where it could go the other way, and they'd say, okay, we're going to shut down. But that's a mighty good piece of rock down there in Lee and Eddy County, and a lot of oil will come out of it for decades and decades and decades to come, unless we explicitly decide that we don't want that to happen as a state or as a country. And I'm with you. Yeah. It's tough. They don't have necessarily the levers to kill the industry, but that is the place where it's happening. And just look at what it's done, for the state of New Mexico and the United States in terms of energy security and the ability to even look at things like a switch to renewables, given the fact that we have all of the fossil fuels we could use. Think if we were in a shortage situation, we're having to import oil at far higher prices because we didn't have our own. So, the bottom line is oil and gas, it's a useful, it's an essential, it's an indispensable product for years to come. And New Mexico has a love-hate relationship with it, but we're not like California. I don't think our state can handle not having oil and gas. I think California's kicking them out, but it's such a small percentage relative to their economy. And guess what? They'll get it from somewhere else. They just don't like it in their backyard.
Yeah, the federal government controls large swaths, about half of our oil and gas production in New Mexico. They have done, some harm in the short term, but mostly that harm has been a long-term proposition. Yes, if we had produced more in the early days of and made signals to that effect, the Biden administration had, you wouldn't have probably seen the price spikes in the early part of the war with Russia and Ukraine, and America would have cemented its role as kind of the reliable producer of oil and gas, and that could have been right here in New Mexico. But we're still not at the point where this industry is somehow going away or anything. In fact, these transitions just write themselves, Wally. According to yet another report, this one introduced to legislators at the Revenue Stabilization and Tax Policy Committee by a financial consulting firm, PFM. This is a Santa Fe, New Mexican article that said, and get ready for this, Wally, prepare to be shocked by this brilliant information. I hope the legislature did not pay this consulting firm very much money or at all, but I'm sure they did. New Mexico is too reliant on fossil fuel revenue, say analysts such as this consulting firm. I know that's really, really shocking. Now, interestingly enough, while...
Is this called Captain Obvious Consulting?
Yeah, I don't know that PFM. You'd have to work very hard to fit Captain Obvious into PFM.
Well, maybe in another language it translates to that.
Yeah, but these people say, let's get the quote here. The exceptional windfalls were due to market anomalies brought on by decreased energy demand during the pandemic, combined with the war in Ukraine causing a foreign supply shortage. The boom is bound to fade, with market fluctuations and changes in energy policies leading to as much as $26 billion less in fossil fuel revenue in the next 15 years from the state's yearly forecasts. So, to make a long story short, their conclusion is correct that they are saying that we're over reliant on energy and fossil fuels in New Mexico. However, I think he is wrong, or this analysis is incorrect in terms of what level of revenue we may or may not achieve. Now, there are you'd have better luck going down to the corner fortune teller and getting her, presumably, to look into her crystal ball and tell, what oil and gas might look like in 5, 10, or 15 years. But first and foremost, as we have said and consistently talked about, this is a production-driven boom. The world is continuing to grow in its energy demands and shows no signs of letting up, despite the electric vehicles and the green policies. Allegedly, the world wants more energy because energy means prosperity. Energy means getting enough food on the table, and those things are not going to go out of style. The one thing that could make this prediction come true would be a massive economic meltdown sustained over some long time period because of the U.S. government's profligacy. That means overspending and debt. Or it could be another reason, but that's the most likely one in my humble opinion. So there's always the possibility that we see demand for oil and gas decline due to some unforeseen, economic blip on the radar or economic speed bump. But I honestly don't think that he is correct that we're going to see any declines sustained over years in the oil and gas industry in New Mexico. As long as those shale formations and production is possible, we will continue to grow. It's just a matter of what we do with the money and whether we diversify our economy or we continue to be impoverished and very heavily reliant on the oil and gas industry because of bad economic policies.
Yeah, and it is very interesting, all of these arguments about oil here in New Mexico. And Paul, the price of oil, it's not really very high. It's in the mid 70s. It's between 65 and 80, and keep in mind that's with everything that's going on in Russia, which is a major supplier of world oil and natural gas. And so your point about what could cause oil production and oil revenues in New Mexico to collapse, interestingly, it's probably the same thing that could cause them to rise, is instability in the world. We saw that in 2007 and 2008. The oil price was up there in the 150 range. And what did you hear? Oil prices will never be low again. And then 2 months later, the economy worldwide collapses and oil prices go way down. And so it shows that, it's called what? Price elasticity. There's lower price elasticity. You need oil at almost whatever it costs. And because the price happens on the margins of supply and demand, little changes in supply and demand can change the price big time. And so New Mexico probably has $150 oil in their future in the next several years, and we probably have $35 and $40 oil in our future for the next several years. So, but whatever we do, ignoring the other parts of the economy and not helping them to diversify. And by help, I don't mean great government giveaways. No. I mean tax and regulatory policies that are reasonable, working on our crime, working on our education, working on, for those of you playing Wally Drangmeister, Tipping Point, New Mexico bingo, gross receipts tax reform is now free space. You don't even get an item. But those are the things that are going to work. It's not these magical policies out there. It's several of these, blocking and tackling, meat and potatoes type policy issues that if the state of New Mexico can make progress with that, they could grow their economy.
Yeah, and this number's going to blow your mind. And again, this is a Santa Fe, New Mexican piece. New Mexico oil production increased to a high of 531.4 million barrels in 2022, fiscal year 2022, a 30% increase over 2021. 1 year, 30%.
And Paul, I looked at the numbers the other day, and then we're basically at 1.5 million barrels of production a day in New Mexico now. That's where we are in the most recent months. So the amount of production that is coming out of the oil fields in New Mexico is indeed, it's staggering. And
okay. So sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
So this was an abbreviated article when I first looked at it. Now I'm getting to their recommendations.
Yeah.
PFN are a bunch of quacks. I'm going to throw this out there. If they have a Twitter page or Twitter, whatever, these guys are deplorably wrong in their recommendations. These are tax policy changes that PFN recommends. This is not a group of solid thinkers in the legislature already. And this is the advice they're giving. 1, reform the personal income tax structure, eliminating the capital gains deduction from these income taxes. So tax increase.
Okay, on capital.
Right.
Yeah, the thing that's needed to grow an economy.
Right. Diversify especially. Reinstitute an estate tax, increase the gas tax, broaden the GRT tax base. Okay, that's maybe acceptable if you reduce rates significantly, but that is not mentioned. And continue to expand excise taxes. So these PFN people, man, if they were...
We implement those, our diversification would be lower in 5 or 10 years than it is now, not higher, regardless of what oil and gas does. So,
yeah, absolute insanity. Boy, I need to do I had not seen that because again they said at the last
take a moment, regain your composure, but it's like I read that read that this morning, and it was like remember when you came in I said their prescriptions would make it worse. So it's like oh my goodness.
Holy cow.
It's like I say that
they're like a 17th century quote unquote doctor who's like, well, you have a headache. Well, just drill a hole in your skull and that'll change your headache real quick. Well, yeah, it may also kill you, but that's the medical knowledge of the time. We have better economic policy knowledge at this point in time. I hope that these recommendations, such as they are go nowhere. But man, that is just horrible. All right, we got to get off this, or I'm gonna just
your head will explode.
Yeah. So speaking of bad policy, HB 132 passed in the 2022 session, placed a arbitrary 36% cap on consumer loans. Yes, Wally and I would probably not go out and get a 38%, 40%, 50% loan because we have these things called collateral and we have steady paychecks and we're not in a desperate need for cash on a short-term basis. We're not living paycheck to paycheck. But, there's a lot of people, I'd say close to half of New Mexicans, living paycheck to paycheck. And they sometimes need access to quick money. And it's better to pay a high interest rate for a short time than maybe to lose your vehicle, lose your job, pay a very high fee to a credit card company, a late fee or whatever. And Daniel Chacon from the Santa Fe New Mexican, he's one of the better journalists out there. Daniel's definitely somebody who still looks at both sides of the story. And for this article, he quoted some people, again, in the New Mexican, linked to at Errors of Enchantment, who worked for one of these companies who's going to lose her job. She said the loans, despite their high interest costs, help people who can't just go to the bank and say, hey, I need to borrow this. It's not easy to go to a bank and borrow money, especially for people who have limited bandwidth financially and maybe in debt or maybe living paycheck to paycheck. Kurt Cook, who operates Navajo Trading Company in Farmington, which just stopped offering installment loans about a month ago in preparation for this law taking effect, said any place where it's required that borrowers have certain credit, assets, and things like that to qualify, well, they don't. That's why they're with me. Cook said would-be borrowers don't quite make the connection when his company informs him he is no longer offering installment loans. And that, I think, may be the most critical aspect here, is that in New Mexico, too often people who vote in elections don't understand the connection between what they're voting for and the bad policies that they are putting in place. And, you could probably do a very direct line between folks taking out these kinds of loans and folks who are on Medicaid in the state of New Mexico. After all, 47% of them are, many of them close to that same amount, living paycheck to paycheck. So whether that is a good situation or a bad situation is more of a question, with regard to the legislature. We know it's not a good situation, but what to do about it could be improved upon by the legislature, which seems inclined, or at least to get advice that's directly harmful to the overall state economy. However, would I take out this kind of loan? No, but it's not something that is geared towards people who have the ability to pay it off right away or have the assets available. It's something that you hopefully get back on your feet financially and quickly pay that loan off, because you don't want to pay that kind of rate. Now,
and then, Paul, I am
right.
no apologist for the payday lending industry, but let me just say that the reason those rates look really high on small loans is there's a processing fee to get it done. And, when you take, and if you look at it as the two pieces, well, what's the processing fee, to get the loan originated and get the paperwork and done and whatever. But if you're borrowing a small amount of money, it's going to be high. And then, it's one of those things, and again, not making the argument, but there are always places to get money, but sometimes there's even worse places to get money than from payday lenders. So,
yeah. So it's a, just bad legislation and bad economic policy breeding bad outcomes socially and for our state here in New Mexico. So, yeah, I agree. No industry, no particular business do we love here in New Mexico. There are always pluses and minuses with all business transactions and business policy making, but just going and banning this, especially at a time of high inflation rates, where that 36% rate cap is even lower in real terms because of the impact of inflation. So, Wally, before we go, a little bit of fun. Your New Mexico Aggies somehow, some way managed to get into a bowl game against my alma mater, the Bowling Green State University Fighting Falcons.
The Pasoli Bowl, the Cereal Bowl. What bowl are they in?
GMAC.
Okay.
Christmas. So,
yeah, the high finance car people.
Yeah, schedule your viewing accordingly. It's interesting now with the woes that have suddenly been visited upon New Mexico State's basketball program.
Yeah.
And that's a whole different can of worms that New Mexico State's on its way to being a football school. So,
Well, yeah.
we'll have to
things that I never thought possible. And when is the game, Paul?
the day after Christmas.
All right, I will be watching, and so we'll probably have another show before that. We will come up with a little bit for the next podcast between you and I on that. So
yeah, so we are firmly in Bowling Green State University Fighting Falcons camp. I get it. A lot of Aggies out there. I love the Aggies. I'm happy when they make their NCAA tournament bids, and also when they make their bowl games in a typical year. They made one previously, like 3 or 4 years ago. So this one, I have a feeling it's not going to go so well for the Aggies, but we'll see. And I'm going to be talking the same level of trash with Bob Clark this week because Bob also is an Aggie.
okay,
Yeah. You guys are both remarkably nice people for that.
for where we went to college.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show, and Merry Christmas. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.